Michael Dowd here. This is my main standalone program that I do in secular and religious settings. I also do this as a follow-up when I preach in churches on Sunday morning, usually delivered on Sunday afternoon or some evening the following week, in Christian churches, Unitarian churches, and other kinds of churches as well. Ecology as theology, inspiring science for challenging times. 5 main subject areas. Un-trivializing God, an I-thou relationship to reality is not optional. Religion's purpose, defender of the future, namer of good and evil. The great story, the epic of evolution, cosmic 101-year timeline. Thus saith reality, what's inevitable, what's futile, and what now? And Legacy 101, staying sane, inspired, and in action in challenging times. So let's take a look at untrivializing or realizing God. An I-thou relationship to reality is not optional. Loyal Rue is one of the leading philosophers of religion alive, and one of his books is called Religion is Not About God. And what he means is that religion is about our relationship to reality. And yes, reality has been personalized or personified as the Lord in monotheistic traditions, or as the various gods and goddesses in polytheistic traditions. But if religion's doing its job, it's to help us live in right relationship to what's fundamentally, undeniably, and inescapably real. I love this quote. The most profound insight in the history of humankind is that we should seek to live in accord with reality. Indeed, living in harmony with reality may be accepted as a formal definition of wisdom. If we live at odds with reality, foolishly, then we will be doomed. But if we live in proper relationship with reality, wisely, we shall be saved. Now, whatever else it means to live in right relationship to reality, it's got to include living in right relationship to the air, water, soil, and life of this planet. It's also got to include living in right relationship to future generations. So I dedicate this program to my granddaughter, Isla Renee, and to her grandchildren. This notion of ecology as the heart of theology. This should be obvious, but it's clearly not for many people. And the concept, the term that captures this is ecotheism. Ecotheism is the essence of deep sustainability, which is opposed to shallow environmentalism. It's honoring primary reality as primary. And the image that's necessary for this understanding is nested reality, nested divinity, nested creativity. Something that we now understand through science that has been revealed through evidence is this nested nature, subatomic particles within atoms, within molecules, within cells, within organisms, within planets, within galaxies. At every level, creativity exists. Stars create the very atoms of our bodies. Hydrogen and oxygen come together. Water's created. So at all levels, and of course, this is obviously more complex, but we're in the middle somewhere. We are made up of smaller realities that we couldn't exist without, like our microbiome, for example. And we're part of larger realities that we couldn't exist without, such as the trees or the algae or the plants and animals that we need to survive. So primary reality are all those aspects of reality that are essential for us to survive and thrive, both within us and outside of us. And all cultures that have been sustainable have related to primary reality as primary. All unsustainable cultures treat primary reality merely as an it to be exploited, which is why this perspective is the opposite of a mechanistic worldview. This idea of nature as a complex clock and God as the clockmaker, this trivial clockmaker outside of a clockwork universe. That trivialized God was no longer synonymous with reality, but it also desacralized nature. Nature we thought was an it that we could exploit and use for our benefit. And nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the great Jewish theologian decades ago, Martin Buber, talked about this. He said that we will not survive, we will go extinct if we do not relate to primary reality as primary, as a thou rather than it. So, ecotheism, right relationship to reality. That is, right relationship to time, right relationship to nature, and of course, right relationship to mystery. And the flip side of ecology as the heart of theology is the notion that human-centeredness, specifically human-centered hubris, must be considered idolatry. Man, conqueror of nature, is the single most self-destructive thought form probably in human history. Two of my great mentors, William Catton and Thomas Berry. William Catton is the author of Overshoot, The Ecological Basis of Revolutionary Change. Many of us consider the single most important book we've ever read. Connie and I certainly feel that way. Many people consider it the most important book of the 20th century. Thomas Berry called himself a geologian, not a theologian. He was a Catholic, cultural historian, and he's the author of The Dream of the Earth and The Great Work, two of the most significant ecological works, especially eco-spiritual, eco-theological works of the last 30 years. Here are these quotes that capture why human-centeredness really needs to be considered idolatry. Human society is inextricably part of a global biotic community, and in that community, human dominance has had and is having self-destructive consequences. Thomas Berry said the most difficult transition to make is from an anthropocentric, that is human-centered, to a biocentric or life-centered norm of progress. If there is to be any true progress, then the entire life community must progress. Any so-called progress of the human at the expense of the larger life community must ultimately lead to a diminishment of human life itself. When religion succumbs to human-centeredness, idolatry, we inevitably confuse good and evil. We can't not. So, demonic economics is a predictable result. I love this cartoon. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. So why are we doing this damage? How is it that we're this crazy? Well, Thomas Berry has a quote that really sets the stage for everything else I'll be doing in the next 55 minutes or so. We are talking only to ourselves. We are not talking to the rivers. We are not listening to the wind and the climate. Most of the disasters that are happening now are a consequence of that spiritual autism. Now, I think one of the reasons we've been, in his language, spiritually autistic, or as I would say, that we've been blind and deaf to what reality God has been revealing through evidence for centuries, is because we haven't fully appreciated what may be one of the most important scientific discoveries about religion, or you could say religious revelations about religion, of the last few hundred years, which is that our brains are inherently relational. We can't not relate, and we typically relate through personification, that is, giving human characteristics to what's more than human, what's other than human. Wendell Berry is somebody who understood the power and understands the power of personification. He said, nature is party to all our deals and decisions, and she has more votes, a longer memory, and a sterner sense of justice than we do. Now, James Hillman, one of the most famous psychologists of the last 50 or 60 years, said that you can't even understand the world's myths and religions if you don't understand our brain's propensity to personify, to give human characteristics to what's more than human. He said, loving is a way of knowing, and for love to know, it must personify. Personifying is thus the heart's mode of knowing. It's not a lesser, primitive way of apprehending, but a finer one. To enter myth, we must personify, and to personify carries us into myth. Now, by myth, he's not meaning an untrue story. He's meaning it the way that Joseph Campbell used the term, a narrative that puts us in accord with the nature of reality. Now, fortunately, Hollywood and Conservation International have gotten the memo on personification in a major way, because they've teamed up and have created over the last few years about 15 or 16 of these 1 or 2 minute videos where some Hollywood star personifies some aspect of reality, some aspect of nature. And you really feel in your gut the power of personification this way. So I want to introduce just one of these. This is Julia Roberts, not speaking about nature. She's nature speaking. Now notice what a difference that stance is, that nature doesn't need people, people need nature, from the idea that nature is a cute bunny that needs our protection. It's a profound shift. So I highly recommend going to natureisspeaking.org. Again, there's 15, 16, maybe more now, 1 or 2 minute videos by some Hollywood star personifying some aspect of reality. And of course, God, whatever we mean by God, has got to include the voice of all of these. Otherwise, it's not reality that we're talking about. For example, we know of no culture anywhere in the world, in the history of humanity, that didn't personify or personalize the climate and interpret what the climate was doing as either divine blessing or divine judgment. And it's not a surprise. I mean, can you think of any force in the universe that more consistently brings cultures into being, sustains them, and destroys them than climate? So right relationship to reality is what fundamentally matters for all species. And this is just as true for humans. So when I use the word God, I'll be spelling the word God all caps or small caps or the Old English way, G-O-D-D-E. And I'll be doing all three because they're all legitimate. And I do that as opposed to just the normal G-O-D, which many people think of a otherworldly clockmaker. So the Old English spelling, many nuns, Catholic nuns, and feminists are doing that now, partly because it's gender neutral, but also because what the term means is reality with a personality, not a person outside reality. And it doesn't matter whether you believe in reality or not, but you better believe that we need to live in right relationship to reality or we suffer, individually or collectively. Now, I can always count on, when I speak in a college or university setting, some philosophy major tries to trip me up and say, well, what do you mean by reality? And I love Philip K. Dick's definition. He says, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. And whatever else is real, whether we believe in it or not. Time is real, whether we believe in it or not. And nature is real, whether we believe it or not. So I say time plus, nature plus. Plus what? Plus whatever you want to believe about anything transcendent or otherworldly or supernatural. But reality is time and nature personified plus whatever else you want to believe. So for example, the real presence and guidance of past, present, and future. What the past is telling us is divinely authoritative. What the future is calling us to do is divinely authoritative. And of course, what the present is telling us, this has got to include God's word, God's voice. Same thing, the power, collective intelligence, and voice of the universe plus whatever you want to believe. And again, this becomes obvious when we think of the nesting dolls. The realities within us and the realities around us must be included in any concept of God that's not suicidal. Any concept of God that helps us come into right relationship to reality. For example, I'll use both secular and religious names, and you can see both are totally legitimate. You can't understand how reality or God created complex life if you don't understand the extinctions. You can't understand how reality or God created the Great Lakes or soil in the northern part of the world if you don't understand glaciers. You can't understand how God or reality created the periodic table of elements or planets or life or even the atoms of our bodies if you don't understand red giants and supernova explosions. Watch this photo carefully. You surely can't understand how God or reality created continents and oceans and mountains if you don't understand plate tectonics. And see, we don't believe that the Atlantic Ocean is growing at the same rate that our fingernails grow. We know it. We've got the satellites to measure exactly how fast the Atlantic Ocean is growing and how fast the Pacific Ocean is shrinking. This is evidential revelation. So I did a TEDx talk a few years ago, my second TEDx talk, on this topic of reality reconciles science and religion. Because the word reality didn't exist 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. So what we mean by reality was captured by mythic language. And I consider the theism versus atheism debate to be a form of collective insanity. Really. I mean, you've got thousands, maybe millions of people debating whether or not God is real or whether or not God exists, when the one real God, namely reality, personified or not, we've been living out of right relationship to, and we are now about to experience consequences of biblical proportion. And you got all these people debating whether or not God is real or whether or not God exists. It's a form of collective insanity. Post-theism, too, makes sense only if you start with an idolatrous notion of God. That is an impotent, finite, otherworldly notion of God. No sane person would smugly say, I'm a post-realist, or I don't believe in the universe, or don't be superstitious, reality doesn't exist. And that's what idolatry is a God that's not synonymous with reality. It leads immediately to human-centeredness. So I want to shift to speaking about the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious significance of science. Perhaps the two most world-known and effective and esteemed evolutionary theorists are David Sloan Wilson and Edward O. Wilson. They're not related, or at least not closely, but they have written together and worked together, and the two of them have done more to further the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious significance of science. David Sloan Wilson, his book Darwin's Cathedral and Evolution for Everyone. In fact, he's probably the most successful and effective person at bringing religious people, including conservative religious people, into a mainstream understanding of evolution. And Ed Wilson has written 2 Pulitzer Prize winners. He's probably the most famous scientist alive. But I want to talk about a distinction that David Sloan Wilson has come up with, which is the distinction between practical truth or practical knowledge, practical realism, and factual truth or factual knowledge, factual realism. It turns out that practical truth is absolutely essential for living in right relationship to reality. It's what religion, over the course of time, has specialized in. In other words, if you act as if these beliefs are true, you'll experience personal wholeness, social coherence, and ecological integrity. Knows right relationship to self, group, and God, or the ground of our being. Factual truth is what science specializes in. But if it's not interpreted in ways that are also practically true, if factual truth is not interpreted in ways that are also practically true, it can allow for technologies that can actually destroy the body of life upon which we depend. And in an evolutionary competition, practical truth will outcompete factual truth every day. So, looking at the evolutionary and ecological purpose of religion and the religious necessity of science, one of the most exciting textbooks that I've ever seen, actually, is Supernatural as Natural, a biocultural approach to religion. Turns out that the experience and language of the supernatural is as natural as flying in our dreams. When we fly in our dreams, we're not having a supernatural experience. We're having a profoundly natural experience. In fact, it's not just for humans. Other mammals have the same experience. And Teddy Goldsmith, Edward Goldsmith, he went by Teddy, his 2 most profound books, in my opinion, The Stable Society, which was all about the difference between sustainable and unsustainable societies based on 200 years of anthropological study, and then his magnum opus, The Way, an ecological worldview. To get a sense of Teddy Goldsmith, here's a quote. It may not be irrelevant to note that even very modest forms of life, like earthworms, dung beetles, and fiddler crabs, have no trouble identifying the real problems they must deal with if they are to survive. Teddy Goldsmith was the editor and the founder, actually, and editor of the Ecologist magazine for over 35 years. And he defined religion as the control mechanism of stable, sustainable societies. The control mechanism of stable, sustainable societies. In other words, if religion is doing its job, it's to ensure that the future is never compromised by the present. And he discovered that in all of the sustainable cultures for which we have evidence, there are 3 things that are common in their understanding and knowledge and experience. The first is that all benefits and all real wealth come from the living world, come from the living biosphere, come from God. That God or reality will only continue to dispense these benefits and wealth if life's critical order, that is, its essential integrity or way, is honored and preserved. Thus, the fundamental role of religion or life ways is to ensure that the future is never compromised by the present by fiercely preserving the integrity of the ecosphere and the critical order of the cosmos, the way. And there are 4 ways that traditionally cultures have done this. God first, 7th generation, sacred limits, and consequence capture. And I have exclamation points because these were enforced upon pain of death or being ostracized. Let's take a quick look at each of these. So God first is simply meaning ecocentric, that is life-centered, not anthropocentric, not human-centered measures of progress and success. We can no longer measure human well-being in human-centered ways. The only way that makes sense is how well is the soil doing decade by decade? How well is the forest doing decade by decade? How well are the other life forms doing decade by decade? What's the oceans and the atmosphere decade by decade? In other words, this biocentric, ecocentric, life-centered measures of progress and success. Again, think nesting dolls. We can't measure success merely on what's happening to the middle level. We have to measure it by what we're made of and what we're part of. 7th generation, failing to prioritize the future over the present is evil. This notion of allowing future generations, either ritually or imaginatively, really both, to judge what we're doing in the present. This is fundamental to all sustainable cultures. Only idolatrous cultures don't do that. Sacred limits. It turns out that material grace limits are real and must be honored. There is a limit, it's called carrying capacity in the ecological world. There's a limit to how much we can take from the living world and a limit to how much waste we can exude to the living world and a limit to how many of us are doing that before the systems, the natural systems upon which we depend start breaking down. These are sacred limits. These are grace limits, and they must be honored. And then finally, consequence capture. The impact, for good or ill, of individuals and groups of individuals must be mirrored back to them, so that individuals, corporations, and nation states that do well to the larger common good benefit. And the more good they do, the more they benefit. So they're incentivized to do as much good as possible. And individuals, corporations, and nations that have a negative impact on the larger body or a negative impact on the future should be taxed or penalized, or there's moral strictures, so that it's in their self-interest to do the right, just, ecological thing, and it's also in their self-interest to not do the unjust or unecological thing. Again, think nesting dolls. It's aligning self-interest at multiple levels. It's the only thing that's sustainable. And I use these terms interchangeably: pro-future, pro-nature, God first, eco-theist, Christian. To be a Christian it has nothing to do with beliefs. It's not about believing in miracles in the past. It's being a savior of the future, a redeemer of humanity. It's being pro-future. This was embodied in our own preamble to the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So it turns out that the two most important questions that every culture, every society needs to address are what's real, or how things are, and what's important, or which things matter. And Religion 1.0, for the first 99% of human history, is what I call eco-animism, the authority of elders. Everything is alive, everything speaks. It's relating to all aspects of reality as a thou to be related to in an honorable, respectful way. And the wisdom for what's real and what's important was embodied in the minds and hearts of the elders, and of course what was embodied in the rituals and rites of passage. Only for the last several thousand years have we had the authority of Scripture, book-based religions, which are prone to idolatry, prone to overshoot, because they tend to freeze the notion of revelation in some ancient texts, so they're no longer present to what reality is revealing through all forms of evidence. This is Religion 2.0. And if we survive, which there's no guarantee that we will, but if we survive, Religion 3.0 is ecotheism. It's the authority of evidence. It's global collective intelligence. See, each of these is collective intelligence. The collective intelligence of elders, the collective intelligence of the groups of men who decided which books were authoritative and which books weren't, and the authoritative collective intelligence of the worldwide scientific community. And I'm not the only one saying this. Pope Francis, Patriarch Bartholomew, the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Dalai Lama. These are three major global religious leaders that are at the forefront of what I'm calling the evidential reformation, where evidence, all forms of evidence, scientific evidence, historic evidence, cross-cultural evidence, and of course the evidence of our own personal experience, is valued over old men and old books. So the unique and necessary role of religion. How has religion ensured that the future is not compromised by the present? Well, all religions that are doing their job, that aren't asleep at the wheel, promote ecological integrity, social coherence, and personal wholeness. That is right relationship to God, the ground of our being, which includes the soil, not just a philosophical ground of being, right relationship to group, and right relationship to self. And what religion can only do is to name good and evil. Religion is the institution that is tasked with naming as good and evil. Good is what promotes ecological integrity, social coherence, and personal wholeness. Evil is what diminishes or destroys ecological integrity, social coherence, and personal wholeness. And that order is important. Right relationship to God first matters. It's shifting from a human-centered to a life-centered mode of discerning good and bad, right and wrong. So Aldo Leopold in a Sand County Almanac said it very powerfully. He defined this as a thing is right when it tends to preserve the stability, the diversity, and the beauty of the life community. A thing is wrong when it tends otherwise. Thomas Berry famously said, "Given humanity's huge and devastating impact on the larger body of life, our predicament and our way into the future can be summarized in 3 sentences. The glory of the human has become the desolation of the earth. The desolation of earth is now our greatest shame and biggest threat. Therefore, all programs, policies, activities, and institutions must henceforth be judged primarily by the extent to which they inhibit, ignore, or foster a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship." My down-to-earth way of saying that 3rd sentence is, from now on, everything needs to be discerned by whether it's pro-future or anti-future. All of our programs, policies, activities, institutions, voting patterns, philosophies, theologies, everything needs to be discerned by whether it's helping us be a blessing to the future or whether it's causing us to live as a curse to the future. This is the fundamental distinction of our time. It's not liberal or conservative, left or right, communist, capitalist, none of that stuff. It's pro-future or anti-future. Good people are dangerous, and great people will engage in great evil when their God is not synonymous with reality, or when their map of reality is outdated by privileging ancient mythic texts over current evidential revelation. But good people are also dangerous and will engage in great evil when they hold the ecocidal and self-terminating belief that we are destiny's darlings, masters of the universe, conquerors of nature, God's chosen species, or the pinnacle of evolution. So let's look at the big picture. Shifting from human-centeredness to God-centeredness, that is life-centeredness. That's the shift from anthropocentrism to ecocentrism. Big green history, that is the epic of evolution, the great story, the universe story. These are different ways of speaking about the history of everyone and everything that global collective intelligence has given us. It's physical evolution, biological evolution, and cultural evolution as our first and only globally produced, evidence-based creation story. It's our common creation story. And David Christian is one of the founders of the big history movement, and he's a dear friend and colleague. And here he is. Notice that he did this TED Talk a few years ago, and over 11 million people have watched it. It's absolutely fabulous. I highly recommend this. But big history needs to integrate green history, that is environmental history. It's so important. Otherwise, it gets off on some diluted techno-optimism or techno-utopianism. And so A New Green History of the World by Clive Ponting, The Environment and the Collapse of Great Civilizations. It's probably the leading book, certainly one of the most profound books on environmental history or green history. That is where the environment is seen not as our surroundings, but it's our source, sustenance, and end. Notice the environment is not just the background or backdrop for human history, but it's an active agent in human history. And then, of course, I've already mentioned William Catton's book, Overshoot, which Connie and I both consider the single most important book we've ever read in our lives. So the great story, the epic of evolution, big green history. Edward O. Wilson said, "The evolutionary epic is probably the best myth that we will ever have." And my most significant female mentor, Joanna Macy, said, "There is science now to construct the story of the journey that we have made on this earth, the story that connects us with all beings. Right now we need to remember that story, to harvest it and taste it, for we are in a hard time. And it is the knowledge of the bigger story that's going to carry us through." So if just for clarity of heart and mind, if it's easier to get our heads and hearts around compressing the 13.82 billion year history of the universe, rounded off to 14 billion years, into 100 years. So at that time scale, every decade is 1.4 billion years. Each year is 140 million years. Each week, 2.8 million years. Each day is roughly 400,000 years. Obviously, I'm rounding these off. Each hour is 17,000 years, each minute roughly 250 years, and every second on the cosmic century timeline is just under 5 years. So at that time scale, at day 2, all the hydrogen was formed. Early galaxies, the first 20 or 30 years, the larger galaxies like the Milky Way keep gobbling up other galaxies over time. Supernovas and red giants, this is where the periodic table of elements are formed, all the metal-rich stardust that creates everything else, or that makes up everything else. Our solar system forms at 67. Earth cools below the boiling point of water at 69, and it rains for eons, and all the oceans form. The only new water that's been added are icy comets that have come in. Earth comes alive at 71. And at 72, some of these bacteria learn to eat the photons, learn to harness the photons, the energy from the sun. We call that photosynthesis. And then from that point on, you've got this long period of biological evolution. I'm not going to go into the details of that at this point. But what I want to talk about is just the last 4 years on the cosmic century timeline. In other words, the last 550 million years, just in terms of temperature. So here we see, on the left, degrees Celsius. On the right, degrees Fahrenheit. Now, this is a logarithmic chart. It's easy to misread it, but it works just fine for our purposes because this here is the baseline average, the 1960 to 1990 baseline average. Now, this period here is the 17 glacial periods. There have been 17 times in human history. Humans, if you go back Homo habilis, walking upright using stone tools, about 2.5 million years ago. So there have been 17 times that the glaciers have come south and the glaciers have gone back. And these are driven largely by the Milankovitch cycles. This is how the Earth wobbles like a top in very predictable ways. And this brings about the ice ages, but only if carbon parts per million are below 200. If carbon parts per million in the atmosphere are above 200, you don't tend to get glaciers. That's why prior to that, if you go back in time beyond 2.5 million years, you've got Milankovitch cycles, but you don't have ice ages because carbon parts per million is too high. So that's why anybody who says that we're going to soon have ice ages again doesn't understand this. So this is evidential revelation. This is God's evidential revelation. This needs to be valued above old men and old books. So here's the projection in 35 to 50 years and in 80 to 100 years. Now, how can we trust that this is what God, reality, is telling us? How can we trust these numbers? Well, let's take a look at what reality has been revealing through evidence, what God's been revealing through evidence over the last 800,000 years, just in terms of CO2 levels, carbon dioxide. So the red line is Hawaii. The blue line is the South Pole ice cores. The up and down are winter and summer. Here we passed 350 parts per million. Where were you in 1990? And this is just like layering blanket upon blanket upon blanket. There's no pause. There's no going back. We know this is... See, global warming is a measurement. You believe in the virgin birth or the resurrection. You don't believe in your weight. It's a number. So now we go back to 1960. We go further back. Look at this. Pre-industrial average was 278 parts per million. Now we go back further in time. Start going back. Ice age. The ice age average was 185 parts per million. Now we go further back. We start seeing a number of ice ages. There have been 8 ice ages in the last 800,000 years. And we don't believe this. We know this. This is revealed through evidence. Here's the same chart in a slightly different form. Now, one of the things we also know, what reality, God, the universe, has been revealing through evidence, is that CO2 concentration and global temperature and sea level rise all march in lockstep. Now, it turns out sometimes one of them leads, sometimes another one leads, but they all march in lockstep. So we know that if carbon parts per million are at 410, it's not going to be long before global temperature rises and sea level rises considerably. So the reason that we can have confidence in these numbers is because the last time CO2 concentration was between 400 and 500 parts per million, and again, we're at 410 now, at that time, sea level was 50 to 150 feet higher than now. That's an average of 3 to 10 miles further inland, and places like Bangladesh are completely underwater. And temperature was 2 to 5 degrees Celsius. That's 4 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit higher than now. Human beings have never lived in that kind of a world. We don't know whether we can survive or thrive in that kind of a world. That's why organizations like 350.org are saying we need to be building topsoil and planting trees en masse. Like millions of people need to do that to sequester the carbon and bring it back down to 350. But that's not going to be easy. That's going to take a global campaign. So coming back to this chart, where is human history in this? Like on a 100-year timeline, what's the entirety of human history? Well, it turns out that human history is just the last week. Homo habilis, roughly December 25th of the 99th year. If the beginning of the universe is 1 second after midnight of January 1st of the year 0, and right now is December 31st at midnight, just about to go in of the 99th year, just about to go into the 100th year. At that time scale, just in the last week, is all of human history. And there's climate change, Milankovitch cycles, asteroids and supervolcanoes, plate tectonics, which of course create volcanoes and tsunamis. This has gone on throughout all of human history, and it's going to continue whether we exist or not, even if we go extinct. So religion 1.0, what I'm calling eco-animism, where everything is related to as having a voice, as having a personality, as needing to be related to respectfully, hunting and gathering, families and clans and tribes. This is the essence of sustainable living. Religion 2.0 is this period, really idolatrous cultures. We start seeing 11:20 to midnight. Agriculture, chiefdoms and kingdoms, city-states, empires, writing, industrialism, the religions of the book. And then if we survive, which I think we could, if we survive the next 80 years, 100 years, we are likely to survive another 2 or 3 million years before an asteroid takes us out or a supervolcano or something. And if we survive, it'll only be because we have come home to reality. Ecotheism. Thomas Berry and Brian Swim called it the Ecozoic era. John Michael Greer refers to it as ecotechnic societies, where technology helps us live in a mutually enhancing relationship with primary reality. Permaculture, global, worldwide. That's where agroecology. This is where we mimic the wisdom and model the wisdom of the living world. And notice the difference in language. You've heard people probably say, well, we're not going to go back to living in the Stone Age. Well, you wouldn't think that way if you said, well, we're not going to go back to living in the garden. See, language is profound. If you want to know what it was like to live in the Stone Age, watch the movie Dances with Wolves. How the Indians, how the natives are perceived there. This is the Stone Age. The Stone Age is simply before we started mining metals and creating weapons based on metals. We can live, it's not living in the caves. And if we survive the future, it will be because we're back to living in the garden. And the only way of doing that is to be pro-future in everything that we do. So if we look at this last hour from 11 p.m. till midnight on December 31st of the 99th year, horticulture, permaculture, sustainable agriculture has been ongoing. We start seeing totalitarian agriculture. That is where we start being totally human-centered and don't care about any other species, start taking over about 10,000 years ago, about 11:20 p.m. Chiefdoms and kingdoms at about 11:30 p.m. City-states and writing about 5,000 years ago. That's about 11:40 p.m. Empires. The axial age, that is the last 2,500 years, the great religious traditions that have emerged during that time. We know of 32 civilizations, at least 32, that have risen and fallen. And it typically takes between 2 and 4 centuries to become great. And then hubris, their own greatness becomes their own undoing, and it takes 1 to 2 centuries to collapse. That's the way most civilizations have risen and collapsed. And we've only had for the last 2 minutes, the last 500 years, this clockwork understanding of the universe, where we think of primary reality not as primary, but as things that we can use. It's all human-centered. So this clockwork universe and an ecocidal clockmaker God, just in the last 2 minutes. And the industrial rape and plunder of the world, 11:59 p.m., just the last 250 years. I call this the age of idolatry. The last 30 to 40 minutes is the age of human-centeredness, the age of idolatry. And by idolatry, I'm not meaning bowing down to statues or believing in the wrong God. Idolatry is human-centeredness. It's anthropocentrism rather than life-centeredness. It's having an unreal notion of God where your divinity is not synonymous with reality. It's failing to honor the living God, the ecosphere, as primary. We are derivative. We emerge out of the body of life. It's taking primary reality for granted. That is, taking the soil, the forest, the water, the climate, and everything we depend upon for our own survival and thrival, taking that for granted. It's having an ultimate authority that leads us to degrade or defile primary reality, God's nature, God's living presence, and thus betray future generations. Again, this becomes obvious when we think of the nesting dolls. Imagine the middle level exploiting the smaller levels that make it up and the larger levels that it's a part of. It's crazy. It's insane. That's why it has to be considered idolatry. And it is. And there are both secular and religious forms of idolatry. The three most pernicious forms of religious idolatry, I believe, are idolatry of the written word, idolatry of the otherworldly, and idolatry of beliefs. Idolatry of the written word is where we think God's best guidance, that is, our best map of reality, is frozen in time in some ancient text. Idolatry of the otherworldly is where we think ultimate reality resides is only outside time and nature, rather than incarnate, embodied, revealed, expressed within time and nature. And idolatry of beliefs is when we privilege beliefs over knowledge. When I speak in conservative Christian settings, I say it's when we don't give God glory for the knowledge that's been revealed over the last several hundred years. Now, there's also secular forms of idolatry. Idolatry of growth, idolatry of progress, idolatry of the market. In other words, idolatry is anything that where your ultimate concern is something other than the health and well-being of the body of life. Growth, progress, market, the market. These are forms of idolatry, secular. Idolatry of reason, where we value factual truth over practical truth. Unsustainable, crazy. And then this idea of man, conqueror of nature. Probably the most ecocidal, suicidal thought form in human history. So just to recap, we've covered untrivializing God, that an I-thou relationship to reality is not optional. Religion's purpose, defender of the future and namer of good and evil. And the great story, Big Green History, the epic of evolution. We took a quick look at the cosmic 101-year timeline. The last two sections that we'll talk about are Thus Sayeth Reality. And those what's reality telling us is inevitable, is futile, and then what now? And then Legacy 101, staying sane, inspired, and in action in challenging times. So thus saith reality. What's inevitable? What's futile? And what now? Well, coming back to our timeline here, what can we say confidently is either inevitable or highly likely in the next minute, the next 250 years? In other words, what does the evidence tell us? Given trends, given the way things have been, what can we count on, bank on for the next 250 years, the next minute? Well, before we even go there, it's important to even have a bigger picture, which is to go out one more year. There will be a 101st year on the universe timeline. And there will be 140 million years from now. Humans won't exist. No mammal our size lasts 100 million years. In fact, most mammals, even close to our size, last 8 to 10 million years at most. That's the average length of mammalian species. So humans won't exist. But we're going to see climate change, Milankovitch cycles, asteroids and supervolcanoes, plate tectonics. This is going to continue. And so one of the things that gives me hope, and I mean this sincerely, is that the worst case scenario, let's say that we create World War III and it goes nuclear. And we wipe ourselves out, we take many other species out with us, and all of our nuclear power plants melt down. By early February, Earth will have recovered. That's 12 million years from now. That's good news, because we're not going to see worst case scenario. We're just not. No matter how stupid we are, we're not going to see that. Now, Connie, my wife, is not a gambling woman, but she sometimes says that even if we destroy ourselves, her money is on raccoons, the descendants of the raccoons, to be the next technological species. That is the next creature that comes to know that it knows, the next self-reflexive, intelligent species. And because they've got manual dexterity to extend they can create tools that can extend their senses and their powers. Dolphins are really smart, but they can't create tools, and they can't domesticate fire, so they don't have that advantage. Or disadvantage, time will tell. Now, John Michael Greer is one of our favorite authors. We've read 14 of his books in the last 5 years, and he agrees with Connie. He thinks that raccoons, or the descendants of the raccoons, are likely to be the next self-reflexive intelligence, the next technological species. And he thinks that the third technological species is likely to be, 100 million years from now, the descendants of the crows. And because the corvids, the crows, are already into flying, and because in 100 million years there'll be a replenishment of fossil fuels, specifically of petroleum, that the great existential crisis, but also the great blessing to the crows, because it turns out that hubris, arrogance, is the main downfall of civilizations, and we assume that's true for other species as well. The great existential crisis and blessing for the crows is that they're going to get to the moon, because they're already into flying. And when they get there, they're going to realize that some now extinct Earth species beat them to it. And maybe they don't have a favored relationship with whatever their name for primary reality is. And that will be the great blessing that they need. So I share that partly just as to lighten things up, because I've been sharing some pretty intense stuff. But let's take a very serious look at what can we expect, what's inevitable or highly likely in the next 250 years, the next minute on the cosmic century timeline. And this is in the best case and medium case intergovernmental panel on climate change scenarios. Worst case scenarios, we go extinct. Well, first of all, there will be climate chaos. There's going to be bigger storms, bigger droughts, growing deserts. Wildfires are going to be more intense and more of them. And there'll be radical shifts in where we can live and where we can grow food. This is now locked in. Some level of this is now locked in. Sea level will continue to rise 25 to 40 feet, at least, over the next 250 years, and that's true even if all humans went extinct tonight. If some virus wiped us out tonight, the sea levels would continue to rise 25 to 40 feet over the next 250 years. And there's not a scientist that deals with the oceans that would disagree with what I'm now saying. The sixth great mass extinction. We are causing the sixth mass extinction. The last time species went extinct as fast as they're going now was 65 million years ago when the asteroid hit. And we are now that asteroid. And a lot of that is already locked in now, unfortunately. And I often grieve about this. The end of the fossil fuel era. It turns out it will be the carbon pulse is what it's sometimes called. This little blip in human history where for 99, all the time in the past, up until just 200 or 300 years ago, our main source of energy was human and animal muscle power, sun and wind, and timber, trees. And that's going to be our energy all the way into the future after maybe the next 70, 80 years at most. A toxic legacy. Think about the sea levels rising 25 to 40 feet or more. Many cities, many of the biggest cities of the world are going to be inundated and unlivable. And many of those cities are not going to be able to afford to move their toxic waste and their toxic stuff away from the oceans. So there's going to be a contamination of many ocean shorelines. Population will shrink to less than 1 billion due to drought, famine, war, and disease. And we can know this because the carrying capacity of the planet is probably less than 1 billion. And we've now done damage to many of the living systems. And we're within 20 or 30 years of living in a post-antibiotic age, so where simple infections can kill us again. So it doesn't require major catastrophes, just drought, famine, war, and living in a post-antibiotic age. Infrastructures deteriorating and the mass migration of people, plants, and animals. Turns out that we can assist many of the plants in moving north because they've been doing that with glacial, ice ages anyway. But what's happening now in Syria and Venezuela and other parts of the world in terms of mass migrations of people, this is just the beginning. Much of Mexico in the next 250 years is expected to be like the Sahara Desert. Where do you think those people are going to go? They're going to go north, they're going to go south. The end of the American empire and the long descent of industrial civilization. Turns out that empires last about 250 years, and we're no exception. We are likely to see the end of the American Empire in the next few seconds on this timeline, the next 20 or 30 years, and the long descent. Could take another 100, 150, 200 years for the full collapse of the industrial civilization before we're back to a dark age again. Depends on how bad climate gets. The death of techno-idolatry, that is the anti-future religion of everlasting growth and human-centered progress on a finite planet. Absolutely crazy. Here's where we start getting into some good news. The salvage and ecotechnic societies, that is where permaculture, permanent culture, where we mimic the wisdom of nature, relocalization. Richard Heinberg talks about all roads lead local, and agroecology. So long after we no longer have the energy to mine metals and mine materials, there's plenty of metals and materials in all of our cities that can be repurposed. So salvage and ecotechnic societies. Millions of people, here's the good news, millions of people will live meaningful and fulfilling lives, die peaceful deaths, and leave a sweet legacy. See, what we learn from the collapse of other civilizations is we do tend to see 20% of the worst of humanity, but we also tend to see 80% of the best of humanity. These are ages of compassion, suffering with. That's what compassion means. And people tend to look out for each other. Not everybody, but many, many people. I mean, just think about young men. Right now, there are millions, tens of millions of young men around the world that are profoundly addicted to internet gaming and internet porn, or both. And that won't be the case when their communities need them. They won't be wasting their time in front of screens. And the interesting thing, the tragic thing, the sad thing is that the vast majority of people will deny most of the above right up until the very end. And what I mean by the very end isn't the end of the world. What I mean is their end, when they die. Turns out that in collapsing societies and contracting societies, most people never get it. They never really accept reality. They deny right up until they die. Denial, the largely unconscious mechanism whereby we refuse to accept the reality of things that are bad or upsetting, or that challenge our worldview, how we live, what is required of us, and or our feelings of superiority. Here's a few cartoons. I've heard of denial, I just don't believe in it. Burying my head in the sand over climate change is much easier now that half the world's turned to desert. It's not denial. I'm just very selective about the reality I accept. And who of us can't relate to this? My desire to be well informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. Stephen Jenkinson is a profound author and death worker in Canada. And this quote is really biting. Inattention to the world's ecological state is well advised, because attention to it mitigates against your happiness, contentment, and your sense of well-being. Having a conscience now is a grief-soaked proposition. If you awaken in our time, you awaken with a sob. So I highly recommend Grief Walker. It's an hour and 10-minute documentary on Stephen Jenkinson and his book, Die Wise. One of our intellectual mentors is William Ophuls. He's probably I consider the most important thinker in terms of bringing the ecological worldview into politics, into the political realm, and how politics can be reformulated from an ecological standpoint. I love this quote. Sustainability as usually understood is an oxymoron. Industrial man has used the found wealth of the New World and the stocks of fossil hydrocarbons to create an anti-ecological Titanic. Making the deck chairs recyclable, painting them red or blue, feeding the boilers with biofuels, and every other effort to transform or green the Titanic will ultimately fail. In the end, the ship is doomed by the laws of thermodynamics and by implacable biological and geological limits that are already beginning to bite. We shall soon be obliged to trade in the Titanic for a schooner. In other words, a post-industrial future that, however technologically sophisticated, resembles the pre-industrial past in many important respects. Many of us are activists, and as activists we focus on a whole range of really vital and important things. And well, we should, because in some cases we can make a difference. Certainly, locally. But all of these are but symptoms. They're not the cause. All of these are symptoms of ecological overshoot. And that itself is caused primarily by human-centeredness, human-centered hubris, both religious idolatry and secular idolatry. Having a trivial, limited, finite, unreal, and otherworldly God, in other words, a God that's not synonymous with reality, is religious idolatry. But having a secular God, having progress, technology, or the market as your primary concern or your ultimate commitment. See, it turns out that ecological overshoot is fundamentally a religious failure. Remember the quote that I started with Thomas Berry? Here's one quite similar. Our difficulty is that we have become spiritually autistic. We no longer listen to what the earth, its landscape and climate, its mountains and valleys, and all the flora and fauna of the planet are telling us. That's why it matters. Nothing matters more than how we think about ultimate reality. So that's why I always spell God capital G-O-D, or small caps G-O-D, or the Old English spelling G-O-D-D-E, as a way of distinguishing it from the idea of God as an otherworldly clockmaker. Turns out that idolatry, anthropocentrism, human-centeredness, always leads to ecological overshoot, followed by societal simplification, that is a collapse of complexity, and population reduction. And there are no counterexamples. So what's futile? We don't want to invest time and energy in what's futile. It's important to accept what's inevitable and avoid investing time and energy in what's futile. While hoping for perpetual progress, imminent apocalypse, or if we all just... It turns out that those are the three most common things that people think in collapsing societies. Some people are in total denial. Things are continuing to get better and better. Other people, there's nothing you can do. That's all going to hell in a handbasket. And other people believe, if we all just... And it turns out that those are the three least likely options. So it's futile. But it's also futile to expect your loved ones to not hope or believe in one of these three delusions. That's why compassion is so important. It's futile to assume that technology or the market can sustain what is unsustainable. It's futile to have faith in the techno-narcissistic religion of everlasting growth on a finite planet. It's futile to expect your instincts to not at least occasionally challenge you and others. There was a period of about 5 years that, in fact, my first TEDx talk was on evolutionary psychology and brain science, why we get addicted, why we get tempted. It's futile to not expect that because our instincts are mismatched. They no longer are matched for the 99% of human history where we lived in small communities, hunter-gatherers, tribes, in the same way that wolves thrive in packs, bees thrive in hives, humans thrive in tribes, and we don't tend to thrive without them. And so our instincts serve us in those contexts, but our instincts don't serve us in the kind of world that we live in now. It's futile to deny that mortality and death are real and necessary, individually and as a species. There was a period of 6 or 7 years that Connie and I did programs on this, on a sacred science approach to mortality and death. If you're interested, just go to thegreatstory.org and you'll find the death page there. Expecting religion or society to repent of human-centeredness prior to collapse, that's futile. Not going to happen. Expecting industrial civilization and global capitalism to run on renewable energy. It may be possible to run some form of civilization, an ecological civilization, on renewable energy, but we can't run this kind of civilization on renewable energy. And it's futile to mistake the end of the world as we know it for the end of the world full stop. See, sanity and insanity, it's not just how we think. If our thinking is aligned with reality, we're thinking in a sane way. If it's not aligned with reality, we're thinking in an insane way. And it's not just individuals. There's collective insanity. This is an image that captures collective insanity. This is in Oregon last summer. I love this quote from Robert Louis Stevenson. Sooner or later, we all sit down to a banquet of consequences. See, that's the great reckoning. We're in the early stages of the Great Reckoning, and it's not because some supernatural being is pissed off at us and punishing us. It's because there are consequences when we live out of right relationship to reality. However, I also believe it can be the great homecoming. Humanity, the prodigal species, we've squandered our inheritance, yes, but we're waking up to our predicament, in the pig pen, as it were, and coming home to reality, coming home to God. I would suggest that especially deserving of compassion and generosity, poor people, communities, and nations who will suffer the most from climate and ecological breakdowns, yet who contributed the least to its main causes. Those of us feeling the loneliness of having to navigate our own downshifting expectations, whilst family, friends, and maybe even spouses are in denial. Individuals, couples, children, families, and communities of our fellow social and mammalian species who generally feel and suffer just like we do. Techno-optimists and free market fundamentalists who will remain in denial the longest and be hardest hit emotionally and financially when reality bites. Religious, political, and social liberals and progressives whose faith in the religion of perpetual progress is currently being shaken, shattered, or abandoned. And religious conservatives and evangelicals whose faith in the Bible has blinded them to what God or reality has revealed through facts about our inner, outer, social, and mortal nature, and who thus struggle disproportionately with addiction, teen pregnancy, domestic violence, depression, suicide, and sin in general. I love this quote from Jonas Salk. Our greatest responsibility is to be good ancestors. And I see this cartoon as a metaphor. The human is saying, someday we'll all die, Snoopy. And the animal world is saying, true, but on all the other days we will not. Teddy Goldsmith profoundly said, "It is an astonishing thought that we can completely destroy this planet, make it uninhabitable, and assure the extinction of our species and countless others without violating a single law." See, many people associate what is legal with what's right, and yet the playing field has been tilted for so long, it's just not the case. So pro-future prophetic activism, it is not just immoral, it is evil to irreparably harm the future for short-term personal or institutional gain. Yet we have a global economic system supported by governments on every continent and accepted by adherents of every faith, ensuring that it's not only legal to betray posterity, it's profitable, highly profitable. So how do we live? What do we do? And how should we confront what is anti-future and thus evil? In other words, how do we protest and nonviolently resist modern-day structural, organizational, and institutional, that is legal, evil? Well, that's what Gandhi was all about. That's what Martin Luther King Jr. was all about. They were confronting systemic evil, systemic injustice, legal evil. And a few months ago, I was in Atlanta, and there was a church that had this poster that's actually the cover of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s autobiography with Gandhi in the background. And the quote there at the bottom says, "Integrity. When your character is built on a spiritual and moral foundation, your contagious way of life will influence millions." Now, I can only hope. So the final section, staying sane, sober, and inspired in crazy and contracting times. Honoring our sadness and grief is vital. All of us have expectations, our climate. There's just so much. Our legacy, many of us, what we did for a lifetime, we felt good about, but now we look back and say, what was it contributing to? And it's important to realize that we were all doing the best we could given what we had to work with. It's vitally important that we have compassion for ourselves. But it's also important to honor our sadness and grief. So I'm sure you're familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and then she didn't have this, but I think this is a vital contribution as well: finding the gift and local pro-future action. Paul Kafurka, he talks about finding the gift and local pro-future action. And what we find in this process is we go back, we cycle back and forth. It's important to realize that I'm sure you find yourself somewhere here, your loved ones. It's important to have compassion. We're all in this process. That's why this is a time of suffering with, of compassion. Building topsoil while planting trees, or building topsoil and planting trees while nurturing community is perhaps the most holy work that we can be engaged in. My wife, Connie Barlow, is at the forefront of this movement of assisting trees in migrating north because of how rapidly trees will go extinct because of climate change. And I love this quote from Paul Hawken. There's a rabbinical teaching that says if you're told the world is ending and the Messiah has arrived, first plant a tree, then see if the story is true. This is a mythic notion. The past is rooting for us. I encourage you to imagine, how is the past rooting for you? How is the past rooting for us? Because whatever has given your life meaning over the course of your life, the final meaning of your life is your legacy. The past is rooting for us. The future is calling us to greatness. And it's important to remember from this eco-theist perspective, from the sacred science perspective, what's a God's eye view of reality? It's not just the view from outside at all. A God's eye view is the view from within every subjective experience, through a dragonfly's eyes, through the whale's eyes, through the squid's eyes, and human eyes. All of that must be included in a God's eye understanding. The eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they are praying for us to see beyond our own time. They are kneeling with hands clasped, that we might act with restraint, that we might leave room for the life that is destined to come. So I've been calling this ecotheism, sacred realism, factual faith. Some also speak of it as religious naturalism or evidential mysticism. I like all of those personally. And there are 6 principles that I've been collecting over the course of the last 7 or 8 years that really unite tens of millions of us around the world, secular and religious alike. And here was my first attempt to articulate these. Reality is our God. Evidence is our scripture. The epic of evolution is our creation story. Ecology is our theology. Integrity is our spiritual path. And a just and healthy future is our mission. Now, obviously, non-religious people, secularists, humanists, atheists, freethinkers, they're not going to feel comfortable with the God talk. For them, many would phrase it this way: reality is my ultimate commitment. Evidence is the way reality reveals itself, and so on. And I found that more conservative Christians and conservative religious people feel more comfortable with it this way: my God includes reality. My scripture includes evidence. My theology includes ecology, and so on. So if you are a religious person, especially if you're a Christian, one of the things that I do a longer program. It's about 15 minutes longer than this, where I really discover or discuss the distinction between unnatural religion or make-believe faith, I'll make it if I just believe, and undeniable religion or factual faith. Unnatural religion is human-centered, otherworldly, anti-future, anti-nature, and it's all about me. It's about my enlightenment, about my salvation. Undeniable religion, factual faith, is God-centered, reality-centered. It's this worldly. It's pro-future, pro-nature, and it's Christian in being a savior of the future, a redeemer of humanity. So if you're interested specifically on the distinction between unnatural Christianity and undeniable Christianity, I have a hour and 20-minute version of this, which has all the same stuff I just did, but another 15 or 20 minutes where I go into the Christian stuff. So just Google ecotheism, ecology as the heart of theology. And I also have a 17-minute YouTube clip on reality's rules, 10 commandments to avoid extinction and redeem humanity. I spent a year and a half talking with over 100 scholars around the world, scientists, theologians, ministers, ecologists, environmentalists. And I said, what is reality telling us? What can we agree on? So this reflects the collective intelligence of what reality is telling us in a sort of personified, thus saith the Lord kind of way. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. Maybe many of us won't be here to greet her, but on a quiet day, if I listen very carefully, I can hear her breathing. So here's an overview of what we just went over, what I just covered. And if you are part of a study group, if there's a group of people that are using this, here are some suggested questions for reflection and discussion. I'm also happy to be on a Skype call if you want to have a Skype Q&A session. Our main website is thegreatstory.org, and right there, the chronological archive and the deep sustainability page are the two places I'd recommend first. I mean, there's just tons of great stuff. The deep sustainability page is over 1,000 hours of the cream of the crop books and articles on right relationship to the future. And the chronological archive is everything Connie and I have created practically over the last 17, 16 years. And then right there, Michael Dowd and Connie Barlow, you can learn all of our text, audio, and video contributions you can find there. And my personal website, michaeldowd.org. And my contact information, michaelbdowd@gmail.com. And then my phone and Skype. Thank you.